This is Emergency Jazz with James, episode 5. Welcome everyone, thanks for tuning in. So far, we've tracked jazz from its birth in New Orleans to the dizzying, virtuosic heights of the bebop era and the ever-evolving landscape of big bands in the 1950s. But this week, it's time we returned to the small band, and a decade where there are more subgenres of jazz than breakfast cereals. Free jazz, cool jazz, hard bop, post-bop, modal jazz. What do they all mean, and how and why did they happen? The answers are coming, along with some extremely long solos, very cool grooves, great haircuts, and lots of space. Up until the mid-1940s, we've seen jazz harmony and improvisation reaching inexorably towards that bebop sound. Wild virtuosic tempos and tritone substitutions seemed the ultimate goal, but when it was reached, the question on everyone's lips was, well, what now? And bebop was a music of extremes, extreme tempos, extreme instrumental technique, extreme harmonic complexity, and so any new music would have to find its expression elsewhere. And this is the simple reason why the 50s spawned so many subgenres of jazz. They were reacting to the bombshell that was bebop, and without a single clear path ahead, musicians went to very different places to find their inspiration. So rather than try and find one clear story through the 1950s, we're going to split this episode up into bite-sized chunks and look at some of the different paths that musicians took during this time, and we shall begin with cool jazz. It is hard to imagine a more extreme reaction to bebop than cool jazz, with its expansive solo sections and slower tempos. And there's one musician who is usually credited as this music's originator, and that is, of course, Miles Davis. However, whilst Davis certainly brought together the musicians that created cool jazz, it was very much a product of collaboration rather than a solo effort. Now, as we heard in episode 3, Davis in the 40s was very much part of the bebop revolution, but his technique was never quite as comfortable as Gillespie's and Parker's at the breakneck speeds of bebop, and even in the early 40s, he conveyed his preference for music with more space and implication. And so in 1948, with bebop still popular throughout the US, and at the age of just 22, Miles Davis joined other young musical experimenters at the New York apartment of Jill Evans, the Canadian jazz pianist and arranger, and it was here that the basic recipe for cool jazz was cooked up. The ingredients of cool jazz were a mixture of Davis's bebop harmonic language and Jill Evans's unique compositional style, which he refined working with the Claude Thornhill Orchestra. This orchestra was a fascinating fusion, blending jazz standards with classical style orchestrations, lush instrumental textures, and slow, dreamy tempos. Here there was a clear alternative to the bebop sound, with prospects of expressivity in new places. Miles fell in love with these sounds, and at these meetings brought together bebop colleagues like Max Roach, together with Thornhill Orchestra alumni like Jerry Mulligan and Lee Konitz to create new sounds. And the result was a highly unconventional 9-piece band with Miles on trumpet, alto and barry sax, piano and drums, but also French horn, tuba, and no tenor saxophone, which was highly unusual at the time. Together, they wrote 12 remarkable new charts for their debut performance to a rather confused but captivated audience at the Royal Roost Club of New York in 1948. This music used a rich palette of impressionistic harmonies, many drawn from classical composers like Debussy. It explored new instrumental textures, blending horns together like a choir rather than pitting them against one another. It slowed down the tempos of these jazz standards and encouraged a more melodic approach to improvisation. Listen now to this section of Boplicity, a track written by Jill Evans, and how markedly different it is to the bebop sound happening around us in 1948. Following their debut performance, and over the next 2 years, Evans and Davis recorded all of these tracks, but it took almost a decade until 1957 for them to be compiled into a single album, and for them to be retrospectively recognised as the birth of cool. This birth of cool band went straight from cult to classic. It showed jazz musicians that bebop was not the end of the journey, and it welcomed them to fresh pastures with a whole new sound world to explore. In the words of jazz critic Gary Giddins, the new cool sound calmed bop's fever, soothed its brow, and brought wreaths to its entombment. Players from Miles Davis's band and others on the West Coast like Chet Baker would keep cool jazz developing throughout the 1950s, and other artists like Dave Brubeck would add to the cool sound with new rhythmic innovations, like in his album Time Out from 1959. But cool jazz was not the only alternative to bebop at this stage. Around the same time, we also have hard bop. Outside of jazz, the early 50s saw an explosion in the popularity of both rhythm and blues music, which had been developing quite independently of jazz, and gospel, which had its roots in jazz but was fused with African and European choral techniques in a religious setting. Many younger musicians started to blend blues and gospel in new ways, and there were two notable results from this. The first you may have heard of, it was soul music. That's a completely different story though. But the second was a further fusion with bebop musicians to create something called hard bop. Here was another alternative to bebop formed from unlikely collaborations. Hard bop preferred medium tempos, slower than those of bebop, forward-driving grooves derived from a more aggressive drumming style, and simpler call and response style melodies reminiscent of the musical language of the church. Now, hard bop was certainly brewing in the late 40s, with bebop, blues and gospel musicians inevitably jamming together, but it didn't hit the big time until a certain drummer called Art Blakey met a certain pianist called Horace Silver. The band that they would form in 1954 would become synonymous with hard bop, and it is of course the Jazz Messengers. First formed in 1954, Art Blakey would continue to run the Jazz Messengers for almost 40 years. Now let's listen from a track called Miner's Holiday from their breakout 1955 album At the Cafe Bohemia. It's got much shorter melodic phrases than the cool jazz of Miles Davis, and just enjoy those wonderful blues harmonies. Hard bop's fusion of bebop, blues and gospel made it one of jazz's most enduring subgenres, and it found its maturity in the late 50s, not just with the Jazz Messengers, but also with performances like Sonny Rollins in Live at the Village Vanguard 1958. The trouble was that in the late 50s, hard bopper's musical language was being superseded by modal jazz, and other genres riding the wave of jazz's ever-evolving listenership. And the only hard boppers that would survive in the 60s would either be those who further embraced gospel and soul influences like Cannonball Adderley or the Jazz Messengers, or those who were brave enough to fuse hard bop with the new modal jazz like Oliver Nelson. But what is modal jazz?
Modal jazz.
I'm glad you asked, James. The term modal jazz can be a minefield of misunderstanding. One might assume that it's called modal jazz because it uses those modes that we first learned to improvise with, Dorian, Phrygian, etc., all based on starting at different points in the major scale, right? Wrong. Those modes have been used since jazz's inception, and their mere presence does not make a piece of music a modal. What modal jazz is really about is a change in relationships between harmonies by breaking down the normal rules of tonality. And to explain that, we must go to the keyboard. Tonal jazz, that is anything before modal jazz, is based on the same principles as most classical music. You have a home key, say C major, and all the chords in each piece are heard in their relationship to that home chord. The most popular relationship of which is the dominant chord, the fifth, in this case G7. You can hear it already wants to resolve to C there. There's a magnetic pull between chord 5 and chord 1, and it leads to one of the most popular chord progressions of all time, which is chord 5 to chord 1. Now, tonal jazz is full of harmonic tension as chords depart and return to this tonal centre, and this tension becomes even more elaborate as jazz moves into the bebop era. Modal jazz, on the other hand, changes the relationship between chords by lessening that importance of coming home to the tonic. Rather than resolving to a major or minor key as its home chord, modal pieces will float around one or two modal scales like the Dorian or Phrygian, or something tastier. Let's look at some specific examples. I'm going to play you two tracks, a tonal chart called Cherokee and a modal piece called Milestones. Here's the tonal one first, Cherokee. Notice that a large proportion of the direction of that piece comes from the chords ever moving about, especially that last cadence where you get chord 2, chord 5, and chord 1. Now listen to Milestones, the modal track, and how the direction from this piece comes much more from the melody and the groove rather than constant chord changes. And so on. This is what jazz boffins mean when they talk about modal jazz's harmony being approached horizontally rather than vertically. It's not about each chord's relationship to the home key, but it's about exploring one or two modal chords or scales over time. And Milestones is the perfect example of this, because all of its musical material is derived from just two scales, G Dorian and A Dorian. And that is it. Many musicians learned this style from George Russell's book written in 1953 called Lydian, Chromatic Concept of Tonal Organisation, which studies the modal harmonic language of classical composers like Ravel and Bartók. Okay, so those are the harmonic innovations of modal jazz, but what impact does this all have on its overall sound? Well, with fewer chords, modal jazz feels unhurried. And without harmony as a structural device, other musical parameters like timbre, dynamics, and melody become much more important in how music is shaped and structured. And this is where we return to Miles Davis. Fresh off facilitating the birth of cool jazz, in modal harmony, Davis has found the perfect partner to bring cool jazz to its next stage. Whilst he was not the first to use Russell's modal harmonic language, just like with the birth of cool, he found himself at the forefront of jazz innovation by bringing the right musicians together. In saxophonist John Coltrane and Cannonball Adderley, pianist Bill Evans, bassist Paul Chambers, and drummer Jimmy Cobb. Together in 1959, they recorded Kind of Blue, a modal jazz album that would become the best-selling jazz album of all time. But modal jazz had not finished with Kind of Blue. In fact, it didn't reach its peak until the 1960s with none other than John Coltrane. But before we reach Coltrane, we've got two more notable subgenres to cover, and the first is free jazz. Free jazz emerged at the end of the 1950s in figures like Carla Blake and Ornette Coleman, where cool jazz, modal jazz, and hard bop sought to subtly change the rules of harmony, instrumentation, and timbre. Free jazz sought to rewrite the rule book of expression completely by abandoning some governing principles of jazz like tonality and time signatures. As part of this, in his groundbreaking 1959 album, The Shape of Jazz to Come, Ornette Coleman completely abandons harmony instruments, leaving only the bass, trumpet, sax, and drums in his quartet. This album does not sound like the later jazz of the mid-1960s onwards. There's still an irresistible groove in most of these tracks, although recognisable time signatures are few and far between. And all of this music is extremely melodic still. Listen here to a section of Lonely Woman from A Shape of Jazz to Come, and you'll notice just how markedly different this style of music making is from anything we've heard so far. Carla Blake was the great unsung hero in the development of free jazz. Her works were as catchy and complex as they were obscure, but her influence really begins in the 1960s, so we shall return to her in later episodes. In many ways, free jazz was the ultimate reaction to bebop. It questioned our base assumptions of harmonic complexity and communication in jazz. It turned them on their heads and instead asked performers to improvise and communicate in more organic ways. And these pieces are so often misunderstood as sort of aimless noodlings that are rather impenetrable in their aesthetic. But consider all of the other subgenres of jazz we've discussed so far in the 1950s. They are built out of a desire to find expression in new corners of music, and in this way, free jazz is no different. There is one character I have so far omitted because he complicates any possible narrative one attempts to draw of the 1950s jazz styles, and that is Charles Mingus. Repeatedly throughout the 1950s, Mingus writes music that predicts the next musical style, sometimes before even Miles Davis gets to it, and yet he does this with a compositional voice so unique that his music is impossible to pin down. Charles Mingus really is a genre all by himself. Mingus had a fascinating musical education as a self-taught classical cellist who only made a begrudging move to jazz in his late teens. Once in the jazz world, though, he flourished and played with everyone from Louis Armstrong to Duke Ellington and even a stint with the Charlie Parker Quintet in the 40s. With the notable exception of Ellington, though, all of these experiences left Mingus distinctly dissatisfied with the music that he was playing. He considered bebop derivative and rather contrived, and the following cool jazz far too introspective. His own compositions embraced influences from all corners of African American culture, as well as Western classical music and other world musics. In his own words, he wanted to create sounds that were as wild and varied as his mood swings and the crazy personalities he kept meeting day to day. This fiery musical style, as well as his unabashed maximalism as a composer, were somewhat unfashionable in the era of cool that was the 1950s. Also, Mingus was constantly seeking extreme contrasts in his music, contrasting grooves, textures, atmospheres, and this was always done with minimal personnel, sometimes just 5 or 6 performers, really quite different from the consistency of Kind of Blue. In terms of sheer range of expression, Mingus's works have few equals in the history of American music. They can be simultaneously tender and furious, introspective or ecstatic, joyous or melancholy, and that's usually just in one piece. Few albums exhibit his remarkable vision more than the 1956 record Pithecanthropus Erectus. This album anticipated the modal harmonic worlds of Miles Davis's Kind of Blue, but it also set crucial precedents for the free jazz movement with a revolutionary approach to open-ended solo structures. Listen here to the modal qualities and open-ended shapes of the title track of this album. In there, you may have heard performers almost arguing or pleading with one another, just as we do in our everyday relationships. This is one of the unique wonders in Mingus's music. He can somehow translate our human interactions into highly nuanced musical textures. Charles Mingus rode the changeable waves of the musical language of the 1950s, but injected all he did with a heartfelt commentary both on his personal relationships and the contemporary African-American experience in the United States. Mingus may not have been one of the most famous musicians to come out of the 1950s, but without a doubt, his compositional voice remains one of the most unique in the history of jazz. If you want one album that epitomises everything I've spoken of, you need to listen to the 1959 record, Ahem. It is absolutely breathtaking. You will find it on the Spotify playlist below the video. And with Mingus, we have made it to the 1960s yet. And that, of course, means that there's just one weird subgenre to decode, and it is none other than post-bop. Rather than something completely new, post-bop emerged as a reaction to the increasingly avant-garde free jazz scene. And it did this by combining little bits of all of the subgenres we've heard about so far. Bebop, cool jazz, hard bop, modal jazz, and even free jazz, they all play a part. However, post-bop also sees a refinement of modal harmonies, increased influences of world musics, the beginnings of experimentation with electronic instruments, and crazy, wild, extended solo sections, but usually with some semblance of structural control, unlike free jazz. I shall not attempt to delve too far into the post-bop world, though I merely wanted to introduce it to you all to get you all excited for next time where it reigns supreme. What I will say though is that again, Miles Davis finds himself at the centre of post-bop's creation, this time with his second quintet with characters like Wayne Shorter and Herbie Hancock. However, they're quickly surpassed by one of Miles's own disciples. We mentioned him earlier, it is of course John Coltrane again. Coltrane has actually been here all of this time, since the bebop era. He even recorded some hard bop solo albums in the 1950s. But it's not until his classic 1960s quintet that he makes his unforgettable mark on jazz with his truly unique post-bop albums of the 1960s. But that really is a story for next time, be patient. Okay, let's put these pieces together now. We started in the 40s with bebop and musicians' reactions to it. We have cool jazz, hard bop via blues and gospel and with spin-offs of soul, and Mingus, who is just off by himself. Cool jazz continues independently, but some players adopt modal principles to create modal jazz. Some hard boppers join in as well. Also, free jazz starts to make its mark around here. Then, with soul, free jazz carrying on independently, the others sort of merge and coalesce into post-bop, which becomes the dominant jazz style of the 1960s. Yes! We've done it! Well done everyone for staying with me today. I hope this gives you all spades of confidence to go out and navigate the weird and wonderful worlds of 50s jazz subgenres. As always, I've got an exciting challenge for you all, and this week it is to go and explore the brilliant world of modal jazz through Miles Davis's Milestones. I'll include a link to a backing track in the description of this video, but as you're playing along, consider the enormous shift in musical priorities, as we've discussed today, that have led to a piece like this being constructed with such simple harmonies. And if you are up to improvising to this piece, prepare yourselves for large swathes of time on the same chord, and a curious feeling that comes from having to create musical shapes and structures using techniques other than just harmony. Again, there are so many musicians and stories I simply haven't had the time to cover today, from Sonny Rollins to Freddie Hubbard, Oliver Nelson, Ella Fitzgerald, even Dave Brubeck, but I will be returning to them all in later episodes. Until next time though everyone, there's nothing left to say other than check out the sweet 50s small band jazz playlist in the link below the video, and if you have any questions, great or small, about any of the music we've spoken about today, please don't hesitate to get in touch. All of you, keep playing as much jazz as you can this week, and don't despair, because really soon we're going to be back with a little bit more